Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Glad you could join us for installment number 7. Let's switch off the headphones and just use the microphone on the machine instead. Okay, good morning. Welcome. This is installment number 7 in our study of the book of Daniel. We're going to do our very best to at least work our way through one chapter each time. I can't guarantee that that's going to be the case every single time, because it gets a little bit more complicated after this. We're in a relatively easy chapter. This is Daniel chapter 6. So very obviously you should have open in front of you the book of Daniel chapter 6. Also, I did send a source sheet, which is long. Do not be frightened by the source sheet. It won't bite. The worst thing it can give you is a paper cut if you print it. So there's a lot of text. We're going to pick and choose. I've obviously highlighted some of the main points. And if you want to come back and study some of these texts in a little bit more detail, let me know. This can be arranged. I mean, the obvious issue is what to leave in and what to leave out, right? So there's really no way to cover one chapter in an hour, but we're going to, look at some of the big questions, some of the big arguments, and ignore some of the others. The choices are, obviously based on my bias and my way of thinking. Obviously, I very clearly favor Malbim, Rabbi Meir Leib Visser, 1800s, as an explainer of things. The real reason I like Malbim is because he summarizes a Barbanel. A Barbanel is very long. Al-Shich is very long. A Barbanel is understandable. And if you'd like to learn that b'fnim in the text, I'd be very happy to do that. But Malbim tends to explain it, and most of what he's saying is drawn from the earlier commentaries. And of course, I'm trying to look for contemporary references here. Here in chapter 6, we've got Daniel is accused of disobeying a law that the nobles set up so Daniel would disobey it. Right? They know their characters. They know what's going on. Daniel has been a powerful person. There's been a change in power in the country. Daniel remains a powerful person. At the end of this chapter, he becomes even more powerful and more important. But they're going to use magical, mystical practices to achieve their goal. And that's a continuation of how things have been from the beginning of the book. The king supports Daniel. This is an important thing to remember. Here in this chapter, the king is a supporter of Daniel. He likes and appreciates his Jewish subjects, but there are powerful people in the court and in the country who resist. We're going to take a look at Midrash. We're going to spend a few minutes on a very long piece of Midrash, and we'll pick out a couple of the pieces here because it starts to deal with why do people oppose Jews in power. Why do people want to get at Jews? And the reason is not what you think it was and not what we've been told it was before. So this is one that's really worthwhile looking at. We should keep in mind the parallels between chapter 3 and chapter 6, right? I'm sure you've all watched the news and you see what's going on in the world. Pictures of obviously observant Jewish people doing this getting down on one knee thing. I have absolutely no comment or really not much knowledge about what this is all about, but bowing and kneeling to something other than what we hold to be God is an issue, right? Obviously, if you're in this sort of particular situation, you've got to go to a posek. You've got to go to someone that you trust to tell you what the halacha is, and that's obviously not me. But what I can tell you is that all of the halachic discussions, whether it's in classical books, Rambam, Shulchan Aruch, etc., or it's in contemporary responsa, they all refer back to what we have here. And example number 1 is the 3 friends who refuse to bow down to the golden statue that Nebuchadnezzar makes, which is chapter 3. And here in chapter 6, Daniel, who continues his current practice of praying 3 times a day towards Jerusalem, which is something that is forbidden by the decree. The fact that the decree is out to get him specifically is is largely a side issue when it comes to this type of halakhic discussion. But there is a very strong comparison and connection between chapter 3, where they're required to actively bow down to something which I believe was not actually an idol. Other readings of that chapter 3 say, yes, that was an idol, and they were very right not to bow to it. Here we'll dip into the discussion of what's going on, where the command from the king is, do not pray to anyone other than the king. That was regular worship by an ordinary religious person included in that prohibition or not. There's a discussion, as they say, shaklavataria. There's back and forward among the commentaries explaining what Daniel's motivation was. So if you have these two pictures of chapter 3 and chapter 6 in mind, then you're ready to go into the halachic discussion. But obviously you've got to take a side on what was going on in the chapters in Daniel. Before we hit verse number 1, we need to say a little bit about history and historicity. It's a wonderful word. How true something is in the sense of history, right? Throughout the book, we've seen in the previous 5 chapters, including this one, which is chapter 6, that there is an issue with who these kings are. And there's an issue about when Daniel lived, right? If you look in the Art Scroll Book of Daniel, which I have in my hand, really nice edition, they're talking about Daniel living in the 500-600s, right? Which is a standard sort of chronology for a Jewish traditional reading. He lived around the time of the destruction of the temple, the end of the first Jewish Commonwealth, rather, right? Churban Bayit Rishon is the period of Daniel, and Midrash tells us that he lived on into the time of Purim, right? Contemporary scholars reading the book of Daniel put it in the time of Hanukkah, that the stories for inspiration from that earlier period were actually written down and publicized to help and inspire people in the Hanukkah story, which is the year 160 or so BCE. So we then have the issue of who are the kings and who are the Medians. I did send you an article and a link to Wikipedia. If you want, you can read that. If you don't, you don't have to. Right? None of this stuff is on the final exam. Don't worry. The issue is that there is a lot to say about the Medians, and they are, number one, not to be confused with the Greek mythology character Medea, who was the granddaughter of Helios, the sun god, and this is a period of 1st century CE. So mythology and Greek aside, that Medea is not what we're talking about. We're talking about a nation called Madai, which is transliterated into English as Medea. They are a kingdom that did exist that we don't know much about. They haven't left behind much of a historical record, and the scholarly, so-called scholarly view of the book of Daniel and the book of Esther as well is that there is a certain amount of confusion, right? My reading of it is slightly different. I would say that there's an intentional fuzzing of all the details. What's important in the book of Daniel is the messages. There's a lot of stuff to be said here, and there's a lot of stuff to be learned, and I think we're purposely being told don't bother with the historical details and accuracy. Okay? Not a difficult chapter, I promise you that. This is going to be relatively straightforward in terms of reading it, unless you would like to get into the Aramaic, which I don't think most of us would. We will have to zip in and look at some of the things that are there, but I'm going to continue what we've been doing so far, and that is reading the English, and then zipping over to the source sheet that I've sent you. If you didn't get the email, it is right there on the Shir Hadash Facebook page. Just click and it'll open. It should open either in a new window or a new tab, and keep an eye on that as well. Okay, if you remember right at the very end of the previous chapter, where we had Belshazzar's feast, the last king of Babylon, and he's killed. He's killed at the end of this feast. and Darius the Mede, Daryavesh Mada'a, received the kingship at the age of 62 years. This is chapter 6, verse number 1. All of the commentaries are heavily into what the number refers to and who the king is, who the king was. There does seem to have been Medians, and who they were and what they were is largely lost in history. As they say, as I have said previously, I'm trying to do a more naive reading in it and to put a good spin on that way of looking at things. We're here to get the main points. We're here to get inspiration. We're here to find out how history is going to unfold. We're here to find out information that will help us understand a lot of other things in the Bible, in Judaism, and in our own lives as well. Okay, so that's a tall order. So let's get to it. Darius the Mede received the kingship at the age of 62 years, and you could look at Rashi in the English there on Chabad.org very, very easily. There is an issue with regard to the years and whose years and how many years each king is entitled to. So it pleased Daryavesh, verse number 2. It pleased Darius to appoint over the kingdom 120 satraps. Right? Term you should be familiar with from the book of Esther, Achashdarpanaya. Right? What's the longest word in the Hebrew Bible? And it's in the book of Esther, Ha'achashdarpanim. I don't know if that comes up on trivia games, but there it is. Achashdarpanim are what are called satraps, counties, and rulers of counties, county managers, county presidents, however it is. There were 120 of them throughout the kingdom. This is one of the things that we do know about King Daryavesh. That from history we do know that Darius indeed organized the kingdom that he ruled. And Darius the First, I do have a note about him. Yep, Darius the First is the king of Persia as opposed to Media. And this is where we see the slipping of one history book into another. Darius I is known from history to have ruled from 522 to 486 BCE, and he's the one who organized the empire. So, who's who and what's what? Right, that's PhD level discussions as far as we're concerned that we're not going to deal with. So he pointed over the various satrapies, viziers, I think is the correct pronunciation. And there were 120 counties, let's get the word right, counties, and they had 3 rulers over them, who Daniel was one. And from these they would give advice so that the king should suffer no harm. They were the administrators of the kingdom. Then Daniel oversaw all these viziers and satraps because of the extraordinary spirit in him. And the king thought to appoint him over the whole kingdom. Right? This Daniel, where it says that, if you're reading in my particular translation, which is the Art Scroll, this does seem to just be the Aramaic idiom that you talk about someone in that manner, this person and then their name. He's the smartest, and he's proved himself over many, many years. Daniel has been around in this nation for decades. So, obviously, the locals don't like it. Daniel is an outsider, born in Eretz Israel, born in Israel, brought to the kingdom of Babylon and now Persia as an exile. The viziers and satraps tried to find a libel against Daniel with regard to the kingdom. Verse number 5. But they could find neither fault nor corruption, because he was faithful, and nor could error or corruption be found in him. Such a line should be said about politicians today, right? 100% honest. Then these men said, "We will not find any fault with this Daniel, but we will find it in him through the law of his God." They knew Daniel was an observant religious Jew. They had seen him operate for years and years. And they said, we'll figure something out. Take a look at text number 1. text number 1, the men said, we're not going to find fault unless we find something against him in connection with the laws of his God. Rashi says this, Nimtza alav alila. We'll find something to accuse him with, right? Through the Torah, through the teachings of his God. If we're able to request from the king a ruling that will cause him to transgress his laws, the laws of the Torah, and he's not going to be able to keep the word of the king, and there you go. Bob's your uncle, as they say. They set him up. That's pretty obvious, even without any level of commentary, right? Thereupon, verse number 7, these viziers and satraps assembled before the king. And you can see how they're using intellect, they're using the laws of the land, and they're trapping the king into doing this, right? Think about contemporary situations, and there's certainly quite a lot to be said on this one. They thus said, may Darius the king live forever. All the viziers of the kingdom, the nobles, the satraps, etc., have conferred to affirm the king's law and to strengthen his prohibition, that whoever will make a request of any god or man for 30 days, other than of you, O king, shall be thrown into the lion's pit. Right? This is an interesting one, to say the least. Right? They are getting the king to make this law that the king is the only arbiter of justice, that the king is the only one to whom petitions and prayer should be addressed. Especially, we'll see. We'll take a look at this in Malbim, and we'll see if we can understand this a little bit. Let's read one more verse. Right? Whoever makes a request of any god or man for 30 days other than of you, O king, they're looking at a newly established king. He has just now taken over the monarchy. And this is a period in which he needs to consolidate his rule, to also show that he has divine qualities, not that he is God. Right? This is not a case of the king appointing himself as God or saying, I am God, or anything like that, but rather that everything in this whole world comes through me. Right? So verse number 9, now, O king, approve the prohibition and inscribe it in the writing so that it cannot be abrogated, got rid of, according to the laws of Media and Persia, which shall never lapse. Right, this is a familiar line, if you remember back to the book of Esther, that rules and laws that the king issues are not allowed to be put aside. Okay? Let's take a step back and say what's going on here. What's the logic of these nobles in the court of the king? And this is where we get to text number 3.
So if we start with the alliance,
3 times in a row. Okay, so look at text number 3, which is Malbim. And Malbim does the very good thing. He asks questions, right at the beginning there. How did the king accept this stupidity? To say, as a ruling, that no one is allowed to pray to their own God. Did he want to place himself as a god? Didn't the king himself also go and pray to gods? This is something that has never been done before. How could they give such stupid advice to the king? Right? What we're talking about, says Malbim, is the first 30 days of the king's reign. Excuse me. And in the first 30 days, representatives came. I'm going to zip through the Hebrew here. That in the first 30 days of the king's reign came unto him representatives of all the surrounding nations and all the subject nations. And these nobles misrepresented. Amru, they said, not a fact, it wasn't a fact, Hiskimu kedei lechazek malchuto, in order to strengthen his rule in the eyes of his entire kingdom and all his people. That everyone who has a request, even if it's a request of one to another, that someone has something that he wants to get from somebody else in the kingdom, the king will actually take over this request because he desires good for you. And his hand is broad and wide to openly give everything that anyone wants. The king isn't here to rule over you and take things from you. The king is here to help you and to be good to you and to show his kindness to you. Thus he will fulfill every request to the point that there will be no reason to ask anyone for anything else. And someone who does ask anything from anyone else is machish tov hamelech v'chasdo, is denying the good and the righteousness and the kindness of the king. It will be an act of rebellion. You see what they're doing here? This is how I've been reading it, and he's completely making sense. He's also completely summarizing Al-Shich and Malbim for us. That someone who asks a request of someone else, I want to borrow a hammer from my neighbor, and I don't go via the king and say, please, can I borrow a hammer from you, O great king, since you are the provider of hammers? That is mecharef, that is blasphemy, that is sedition, that is rebellion, and you deserve to be thrown into the pit of lions. Right? This is the whole point that they are up to here. Right? Here we go. Let's continue. Verse number 11. When Daniel learned that the writing had been inscribed, he went home. He had windows open in his upper story facing Jerusalem. I guess he lived in an apartment or a house with a few floors. And 3 times a day he fell to his knees and prayed and gave thanks before God, exactly as he used to do before this. Basically, Daniel thinks that the decree is not including regular prayer to God. We'll see how this plays out in the commentaries, but Daniel seems to have in mind not that he is rebelling against the king completely or at all. And the king actually holds that he is not rebelling. Daniel is not rebelling by davening mincha, as we say in our terms, right? Because these are just standard, ordinary, everyday prayers that everyone is entitled to do, right? So the issue that does come up, and looking at the questions of what are you supposed to give up your life for as a Jewish person, this is probably not one of them. All right, we'll see how this gets worked out. But look very carefully at the text here. He had the windows open in his upper story, right? The upper room of his house, the windows were open, facing Jerusalem. Right? Sounds very familiar. Those of us who are lucky enough to live in the holy city of Jerusalem, we face the Har Habayit, we face the temple. And 3 times a day, Beirach al birchohi, he kneeled down on his knees. Right? Not something we do today at all, but there seems to be a distinction historically between private prayer, where Jewish people did in fact kneel, and public prayer, where they always stood up. He got down on his knees, prayed, and gave thanks before God, exactly as he used to do before this. These men, the conspirators, assembled and found Daniel praying and supplicating before his God. There is going to be a diuk, there's going to be a very careful analysis of the words that they're going to not tell the 100% entire perfect story of what they saw. They'll change some of the details, right? Take a look at text number 4. I printed the whole thing, but it's safe. It really is. Don't be afraid of Midrash. Never ever be afraid of Midrash. This is the Midrash on Tehillim. The Midrash is called Shocher Tov. It's the name comes from a verse in Proverbs. I'm pretty sure it's Proverbs chapter 17. That someone who searches after good will find good, and someone who searches after the opposite of good will find the opposite of good. Right? You go to where you want to go to. Popular quote. If you're looking for good, you'll find it. If you're looking for something else, you'll find that too. I've included a link to Psalm number 64 because what the Midrash does is understands Psalm number 64 as having been written by King David in the words of, or putting words forward in time into the mouth of Daniel in this particular circumstance and time of his life. It's interesting because it really, really does work nicely. Okay? Skip to the overlined sections. It's a little bit bluish or grayish, depending on how you see colors. 1, 2, 3, fourth line down. Text number 4. Hodia HaKadosh Baruch Hu David. Right? Divine inspiration here. We're talking about, and this is my point of view with all of the text that we're looking at here. There's God behind it all. And you don't have to look very far to see how this works. God told King David what they would be doing to Daniel. Why? Here's the really, really interesting bit. And here's where we move from chapter 3, which is King Nebuchadnezzar trying to upend and uproot the picture that he saw with the statue. Right? Remember back to chapter 2, the statue made of 4 different metals, talking about how his kingdom is going to decline, be passed to others, and eventually just come to an end. He makes a gold statue in a very specific place in the plain of Dura, which is connected with the Tower of Babel, which is a place of magic, or black magic, if you want to say that. We're going to see hints of this here too. That is the ability to use what we would call spirituality, Zohar, mystical principles, and try to get God to do things as they want the world to be. Right? Change God's mind, uproot God's plan. Right? God's plan obviously includes the supremacy or the ultimate supremacy of the Jews and everyone living in peace and happily ever after. Right? But here's what's going on here. And this is the insight from the Midrash Tehillim. The Midrash Tehillim is one of the more mysterious ones where it comes from. It seems to be first heard of, and so it's probably begun to compose in the 11th century in Narbonne, France. 1000s is where it starts, but in terms of its actual content, there's additions from a couple of hundred years later. Right? God told King David what's going to be happening to Daniel. What's the point of all of this? If these people were able to go up to heaven, remember the Tower of Babel picture here. La'asot im Hashem milchama hayu osim, and to battle and war against God, they would have done that. I've never seen this thought before. That what we're looking at here is exactly what we have in the Tower of Babel, Migdal Babel, where they decided to go up into heaven, build a tower high enough, fight and defeat God, right? Or at the very least, fight and defeat the plan that God has for people, which they didn't particularly like. If they were able to break into heaven and to subvert heaven, that's what they would have done. Because they were not able to go up to heaven, fight God, fight the angels, fight God's plan, this is what they did down here. So here's a total, complete, different vision or version of why people attack Jews. People attack Jews with any amount of power. People attack Jews with a perceived power. Because they can't get at God, they get at us. So, how did the nobles and rulers of the land get the king to do this? Skip the next few lines. They said to the king, "You are not a real king. Kol hamelachim gozrin gezerot. You've ascended to power, and you have not issued any decrees." Right? You, in your entire life, you're 62 years old, you're a king, you haven't done anything kingly enough. Make some decrees. Right? That's not here in the text. That's the Midrash certainly pulling that up. The nobles are trying to appeal to the vanity, the insecurity of the king, but they're also trying to trap him. Right? It's like the president of a nation. Think of it in terms of family. How our children sometimes conspire together to get us parents to do what they want to do. Right? But this is on a grander scale. I'm going to zip on into the next little overline section there. It should be so grayish or bluish. What's Daniel praying about? Kevan shiyeh hamincha. They catch him around mincha time in the afternoon. Hitchil hitpalel, and he said, "I'm praying for these Rishayim. These are people who are out to get me. I need to pray to make things good for them. I'm not asking Hashem to save me. That will be a request. I'm praying for the welfare of the nobles of Persia." We'll get to the rock bit. That's the yellow piece there. There's a single line there. We'll come back to that one. What do we got here? The next one is number 4. Okay, little bit of halacha. Mishnah Torah, Rambam. We derive halacha from this particular text. The halacha is, how do you pray and where do you pray? Right? And you've got the English there. The rules for the place where a worshipper must pray. Stand in a low place, turn your face to the wall. Windows or doors towards Jerusalem should be opened. Stand facing them. And the source is Daniel 6:11. Right? Neged Yerushalayim, text number 5. Opposite Jerusalem, right? Neged means in the direction of, even though the temple was no longer standing at that particular point, right? Remember, Daniel's been around in Babylon for an awful long time, many, many decades, and when he was first taken to Babylon, the temple still stood in Jerusalem, and now it no longer does. Even though it's destroyed, he did, as King Solomon said in Book of Kings, chapter 8, first Book of Kings there. Next comes the big questions. Text number 6. Right, again, Malbim, and he's relatively long, but the question has to be asked, just as it was asked in the previous chapter, in chapter 3. Why did Daniel give himself over to being killed because of tefillah? Right? Here is a Jewish law question. And we have a case here that is not as clear-cut as it seems. The Torah tells us very clearly, V'chai b'hem. You're supposed to live by the laws of the Torah. And obviously, from the basic rules that we have, you are only obligated to let yourself be killed for certain very specific laws, absolute fundamentals. Right? Prayer is not one of them. And in any event, Daniel could have very easily davened behind a closed door and a closed window and no one would have known it. And he would have satisfied all the rules of prayer. Right? This is what he's saying here. The verse says, Lo nishmar klal. The text says Daniel didn't bother to do anything to protect himself. Did he not know that he was risking his life in all of this? Right? Daniel, of course, knew. We're into like the second paragraph here. He did not abandon his 3 times a day prayer, and he didn't hide himself or go somewhere else. He opened the windows, and all the neighbors were able to see. Here's an interesting way of looking at it. Lo hayat mechuyavim sor nafsho. In terms of halacha, in terms of analysis of Jewish law, this is Malbim talking. Obviously, he's projecting backwards because all the rules and regulations with regard to whether you should give up your life in this sort of situation is this situation one in which you should give up your life, right? But reading back and projecting the halacha back, this is a mitzvah aseh, this is a positive commandment, and according to Ramban, prayer is only d'Rabbanan. It is not a biblical rule altogether. And he would have been quite okay to even not have davened at all, not to have prayed. And in any event, and here's what we started off talking about, and we quoted Malbim on this. HaMelech lo nitkavein lahavir al dat. The intention of the king in making this rule was not to get people to transgress laws. It was merely to solidify his kingship and his rulership and his influence, right? To get people to like him and to respect him as king. Why did Daniel do all of this? Okay? Okay, let's move on a bit. There is definitely more in the Daniel story here and in the Malbim. Okay. Zipping along. These men assembled, found Daniel praying, supplicating before God, which is verse number 12, on to verse number 13. They approached and spoke before the king concerning the king's prohibition. Right, here they are. They're being smart. They know the king likes Daniel. They know the king did not have in his intention that ordinary personal prayer should be prohibited. But they're trapping him. They're literally trapping the king. They're using the laws, the rules of the country, and they're saying, King, you got to do this. Right? The nobles are manipulating him. They approached and spoke before the king concerning the prohibition. Did you not inscribe a prohibition that any person who would make a request of any god or person for 30 days other than you, O king, would be thrown into the lion's pit? The king replied and said, the matter is true, according to the laws of Media and Persia, which shall never lapse. Oy. Then they exclaimed and said before the king, Daniel, who is one of the people of the exile of Judah, has not paid attention to you, O king, and to the prohibition. 3 times a day he prays his prayer. Then the king, when he heard the statement, was deeply grieved, and he set his heart on Daniel to save him. I've pulled out a couple of the texts here that are dealing with the words. It's not massively important to understand the analysis of how this works. Sam, Baal. The king tried really, really hard to find a way to save Daniel through his own laws. He tried to rescue him. Then these men assembled around the king and said, Know, O king, that the law of Media and Persia is that any prohibition or statute that the king established cannot be altered. It is as it is written. When we tricked you into writing it, when we seduced you and fooled you into making this law, that's how you wrote it. And you can't change it because that's the law too. Right? Look at text number 8. Malbim on Daniel chapter 13. That's exactly what I just said. Let's stick it at Daniel. There is certainly room to get Daniel off the hook. And they were afraid that the king would find out what they were about and what they were up to. And he would be able to interpret the law to free Daniel. So thus they started off their conversation at that point with, O king, there's a law that cannot be changed. Right? And he had no choice but to agree with them. How did the king try to save Daniel? Malbim, again, this is text number 9. if there is a rule in the nation of Babylon and in Persia at this point that you can't change the rules, what on earth did he try to do? He said, I never intended Daniel to be involved in this. And I never intended to have this apply to regular prayer or to general prayer, only to a new request. And it's not appropriate to get someone to transgress his religion. Right? It's not a very big step to read this into what the king is actually saying. That his job is not to remove other religions. Right? It's not the story of Hanukkah. It's not the story of other times in our history when religion is being blotted out. We're just centralizing and focusing one aspect of this whole prayer and request thing. He tried to find some way out of it. Right? Next one. 10. No way out of this. You can't change this yet again. The king continues, and he continues to say in chapter 6, verse 17, they brought, they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. And the king exclaimed to Daniel, may your God, whom you continually serve, save you. Right? Elahach, your God, he says, to whom you pray always, hu yeshei zevinach, he will save you. Right? Remember, the kings have had a good relationship with Jews, and they have seen that Jewish people have something really serious behind them. They may themselves have gone to their various temples of Marduk and Bel and whatever, but they had a great deal of respect and acknowledged the power of the God of Israel, whom Daniel worshipped and served. Okay? Let's take a look at text number 11. Yeah, text number 11. Gemara in Megillah, which is to some degree a side issue, but it's not. When someone says something nice to you, when someone gives you a bracha, don't just accept it. Accept it as being something that can really happen. One should never regard the blessing of an ordinary person as light in your eyes, as two of the great men of their generations received blessings from ordinary people whose blessings were fulfilled. The one with Daniel is what we're interested in. Darius the king says to him, your God whom you serve, he will rescue you. That is giving him a bracha. This too was fulfilled when Daniel was saved from the lion's den. Always accept a bracha, and also on a further extension of this, look for good things that people are saying to you as a portent, as a sign of something good happening. Okay? Verse number 18. A stone was brought and placed over the opening to the pit. And the king sealed it with a signet ring and with the signet of his nobles, so that his will regarding Daniel could not be changed. Right? The will of the king and not the will of the nobles. Let's look at text number 12, which is Rashi. V'huvat even achat, one stone was brought. This is really interesting, and this is what we skipped over in the Midrash, in Tehillim. A particular stone was brought. In the land of Israel, not in the land of Israel, in the land of Babylon, there were no rocks. They didn't have big rocks there. They had bricks. As it says, Hava nilvana levenim, going back to Genesis chapter 11. Why was the Tower of Babel made of bricks, the Migdal Babel? Right, so for homework, go read up again, Genesis chapter 11, Breshit Yud Aleph, the story of the Tower of Babel. They had to make bricks because they didn't have natural stone or rocks that they could use to make the tower. This is a connection that we do have also here. And for this particular purpose, angels brought this particular rock from the land of Israel. And Rashi is quoting a Midrash here. It's not in the Midrash Tehillim that we have, it may be somewhere else. That God made a Tanai, God made a condition with various elements at the time of creation, that they would do good and they would do no harm and even do good, even though they're not necessarily positive forces, right? And we're dealing specifically with the creation of the sea. God said at the time of the creation of the sea that it should split, the Red Sea should split for the Israelites after the Exodus. Fire, back into our time, when God created fire, he said, you are fire, but you, fire, will cool down for Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah when they get thrown into the fiery pit. When God made lions, he created the lions and said to him, go eat people as necessary, or as I instruct you, but do not hurt this man Daniel, who will come into existence in a certain time, in a certain place. And similarly, God said this to a rock. And this particular rock would protect and not cause harm for Daniel. The king has in mind here, and this is Rashi being, really quite expansive here in figuring this out, that from the lions that he couldn't save him. The king was not able to save him from the lions, but he was okay on that part, right? God had already made a condition with the lions when he created lions. But what the king is afraid of is that the nobles would come back in the middle of the night, see Daniel sitting there petting the lions and treating them as pets, and they would shoot an arrow at him. So God made a condition with, number one, the rock that should protect the entrance, and number two, with metal and weapons, that they should not harm Daniel. And this is something that is here behind the text telling us that the will of the king to save Daniel is going to continue and is going to be carried out. Okay? All right, let's go on a little bit in the text. Verse number 19. The king went back to his palace and went to bed fasting. Couldn't eat. Had no table brought before him. The kings in those times used to eat by themselves in a separate room, not with other people. He couldn't eat. Sleep wandered from him. Couldn't sleep at night. Obviously, he's very concerned. He needs Daniel. Daniel's a very useful and important person to him. The king arose in the darkness before dawn, went in haste to the lion's pit. When he drew near to the pit, he cried out in a sad voice. The king called out and said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, is your God whom you serve able to save you from the lions? Daniel spoke to the king and said, may the king live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they did not wound me, because merit was found for me before him. And before you, O king, I have done no harm. Right? So Daniel is agreeing with the king's reading of the law of Persia and Media that he was tricked into making, that even according to this rule which he was tricked into making and issuing and decreeing, that he had not done anything wrong against the king, against the rules, or against the God whom he continually served. Right? So God sent his angel. We don't have a picture of an angel here. This is a story that we're getting. It's text. But Elahi shlach malache, God sent his angel, v'sagar pum aryavata, and sealed up, closed the mouth of the lions. We don't get to see the angel as we did with the furnace and the men walking about there. The interesting thing comes up in Rav Sadia Gaon, which is not on Sefaria and is here in my book. And he's quoting Zohar, that there's an even more magical, mystical thing that happened here. The prophet Habakkuk, right? Habakkuk is active in the land of Israel at the time. And God brought the prophet Habakkuk together with people that he was working with in the fields and their lunch bags, and brought all of that magically to the lion's den. And they sat down there with Daniel, ate and drank, praised the Lord, learned Torah, and then when they were finished, God magically took Habakkuk and his friends back to Israel there. Okay? And again, there's classical pictures of how all of this plays out. Daniel is fine. And the king is, of course, very, very happy. And that takes us to verse number 24. The king was very pleased. Right? Sagit tehed. He was very happy. And he commanded that Daniel be brought up from the pit. Daniel was brought up from the pit. And no wound was found on him, for he had trusted in God. The king gave command, and they brought those men who had slandered Daniel, and they threw them into the lion's pit, them, their children, their wives. They had not reached the floor of the pit when the lions overpowered them and crushed their bones. Ooh. Right? Text number 13. Let's see, we don't have that much left. But there's a few texts we need to read here. Yeah, text number 13 is Malbim saying exactly what I just said. I did not transgress what the king told me. I followed your rule. Your rules were not intended, levatel mitzvat Hashem, to put aside any of the commandments of God that I observe, and also none of the rules of any other's faith. Right? If I had disobeyed the king, then obviously the lions would have got me and would have been perfectly legitimate. Right? So why did the king command to throw the people who plotted against Daniel into the lion's pit? This is text number 13. It didn't happen. Right? Malbim is again getting quite halachic here. He's saying that what they planned to do to get Daniel killed didn't happen. So why should they be killed? The murder didn't take place. Right? Okay, zip on ahead here. Let's read another little bit of the text here, and then we will get to the last couple of comments in the source sheet. Okay, they did not reach the floor of the pit when the lions overpowered them and crushed their bones. That is clearly an open question. I don't see Malbim answering his question very clearly, other than saying Natan Pikuda Shiyiru et Elohei Daniel, that the rule is he needs to put the fear of God in them. That seems to be what it is. Yeah. Okay, verse number 26. Then Darius wrote, he writes another letter, to all peoples, nations, and languages who dwell on the entire earth. May your peace be abundant. An order is hereby issued by me, that in all the dominion of my kingdom people shall tremble and be in fear before the God of Daniel. Right? It doesn't say that you have to abandon your idolatry, because that's something they couldn't do. There are regional gods that have to be sacrificed to, etc., etc. He is a living God and endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion is until the end. He saves and rescues, performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He has saved Daniel from the lions. Daniel met with success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Right? So here we're getting a bit of the questions of who's who. Daryavesh is Mada'a, he is a Median, and Koresh is Parsi, he is Persian. Let's see. Text number 15. This Daniel had great success in the next king as well. And previously in chapter 1 at the very beginning, Daniel lived and served until the first year of King Koresh, Cyrus. And according to Hari'ah, to Rav Yitzchak Abarbanel, according to what was written in the Yosipon, we've mentioned the Yosipon before, Josephus in abbreviated form, common and used by the classic Jewish commentaries in the Middle Ages, that after Daniel was thrown into the lion's den, he decided to retire. I'm guessing I would too. Going through that sort of accusation and ordeal, he asked the king, I've had enough. I want my pension. He received permission, and Zerubbabel, who's a character that we will meet, he becomes one of the leaders of the return community when they go back and build a second temple and reestablish Israel. Zerubbabel takes his place. And in that particular time, Darius the king died, and Koresh took his place. And stayed there until the exiles returned to Jerusalem. Okay. And Rashi has to tell us there, Shemalach achar Daryavesh, Koresh rules after Darius, and the king Daryavesh ruled only a single year. And he is killed in battle, as we read in the Sefer of Yosef ben Gurion, Yosipon, Josephus again. And Koresh was placed in the rulership there. One of the things that we started off with is the issue of who's who. And the commentaries are divided, and you could certainly make a chart indicating, according to Rashi, according to Malbim, according to whoever, who's who, when, what, and where, and how, and the big question of which king lines up with which king that we know from history and from archaeology, which is a subject that is, of certain interest. Who was the pharaoh that was the one who was defeated at the Red Sea and the Exodus story? There are many things to be said from this, of course, proving the truth of the Torah, that the Bible needs to be verified from outside sources. I can look at a history book and I can identify certain of the characters. We can certainly identify Darius the First. We can certainly identify Cyrus, and maybe even another Cyrus, right? But that's a different reading of the book. That's not the reading of the book that I have in mind when I open it, right? I open any book of the Bible, and it's not a book of history. It's telling me some very, very big points. It's giving me insight into how things operate in the world today. That Jews are often put into very difficult positions. That Jews who do well are put into incredibly difficult positions by people who are jealous of them. But what is underlying their jealousy? I mean, one of the most simple and probably simplistic explanations for anti-Semitism is jealousy, right? And we see this. It's often directed against people who are not Jewish and from other ethnicities and nations who have done well or better than certain other classes. What's going on? And that's what the Midrash Tehillim is bringing up. And I'd like to maybe spend a little more time looking at if there is indeed a parallel source. It seems to be one of the few, if not the only one, that says the battle against the Jew here is really a battle against the God of Israel. And that is something that started right at the very beginning of the book of Genesis, where the people got together in Babel, same place, tried to build a tower to storm heaven. It's what we have here in the earlier chapter in Daniel, chapter 3, where the king gets a prediction about how life is going to go, how history is going to play out. And he says, no, I want history to favor me and my kingdom and my bloodline. And here we see it on entirely the human level, that it doesn't look like they're actively doing any magic or black magic or using mysticism, but they are taking the route that is available to them to attack God's plan for humanity, which is peace, harmony, moving towards the end of days that's going to be good, right, where we'll all live in peace and harmony, and say, no, we have to be in charge. It can only be on our watch that good things happen. And by battling the Jew here, they are in fact declaring war and trying to battle against heaven and heaven's plan. Right? So here again, we're at stuff that we talked about literally at the very beginning, where Genesis stuff comes in, Bereshit. The purpose of creation is that there should be good things, that people should get along, that there should be happy, cordial, peaceful relations among people. But there's loads of folks who don't want that. And there are loads of people who want to take the power and authority to themselves. And you can apply this, of course, to any sort of circumstance and situation you wish. Make a drasha out of it for the news of the day, the news of tomorrow, whatever's going on. Okay, we are past the official time limit. Thank you all for your time and attention. This brings us to the end of the first half of the book of Daniel. Daniel and the Kings. The rest of it is the end of day stuff, which is, I think, what most of us are here for, to try and find out what's going to happen in the end of days, to see if we can see around us any of the signs that are given in the book of Daniel. And we'll be into the four beasts, which Daniel sees, representing four kingdoms. And you'll see it's not simple reading, but it is going to be totally fascinating reading, because the number 4, the 4 animals, these are going to be something that is very, very significant. So before next week, you should do the following. I'm going to give you a little bit of homework. Go back in number 1, read the story of the Tower of Babel, Genesis, Bereshit chapter 11. That's going to fill in some of the background to what we've been seeing here. And go back and look at chapter 2 and 3 here in our book of Daniel, because we are going to be seeing this 4 nations thing all over again. Okay? Have a wonderful day. Be well, be safe, and learn lots of Torah and do lots of good things.